Unlike Navigation 2, Navigation 3 does not have a concept of bottom sheet or dialog destinations. So in this video, I'll show you how I made the migration of my bottom sheets and dialogs into Navigation 3 in my personal projects. Let's go. Here I have a rather simple nav display. Inside my entry provider I have 3 destinations. And as I mentioned before, everything in Navigation 3 is an entry, so we don't have a concept of a bottom sheet. Now, truth to be told, I'm not a big fan of adding bottom sheets as dedicated destinations, but a project that I've inherited already had that, and I thought it's gonna be a great example to see what we can do with Navigation 3. So this last entry is opening my custom bottom sheet that looks like this one, and then we are navigating to this entry, or we are opening that bottom sheet when we are navigating from my artwork screen on navigate to artwork details. So when clicking on an item, we are opening that bottom sheet. Now let's see how does it look like. So here is the application up and running. We have some artworks here, and if I tap on one of them, we are opening the bottom sheet. As we can see, this is far from ideal because the screen that was supposed to be there is gone. So the screen that was underneath when we are showing a bottom sheet should stay, and then we are showing the bottom sheet on top. What happens here is we are having a full screen for the bottom sheet. Now, of course, we can expand it or collapse it, but only when we collapse it fully, the initial screen comes back. So how do we fix that? Back to the code. I mentioned that in Navigation 3, everything is an entry, so we don't have a concept of a bottom sheet as a destination, but what we have instead is a scene strategy. So what we can do in this case is first we can define a scene strategy for our bottom sheet here. I'm going to define a new val, and I'm going to name it bottom sheet scene strategy. Then I'm going to call a remember, and inside the lambda, I'm going to instantiate a bottom sheet scene strategy. As a generic, I'm going to pass a nav key because my destinations are also deriving from a nav key. And then inside my nav display, I'm going to pass the bottom sheet scene strategy as a scene strategy argument. Now let's run once again and see what happens. Here we got the application loaded, so let me tap on something and boom, now the bottom sheet works the way we expect it to work. So we can expand it, collapse it, or collapse it entirely. Everything works as you would expect it. By the way, I guess you are noticing this sticky button on the bottom of the sheet regardless if the sheet is open or not. Wanna know how I did it? Let me know in the comments below. Back to our code, let's explore what is this bottom sheet scene strategy. As I've mentioned in my previous video about Navigation 3, the library itself has a scene strategy interface that we can override to create our custom scene strategies. And then this interface by default has a few overloads. As we can see, we have dialog scene strategy. So for dialog, we already have one. List, details, scene strategy, single pane, and so on and so forth. I've created my own scene strategy for the bottom sheet. So for a dialog, I don't have to because it's given. For the bottom sheet, I created my own. And this is what does it look like. So what are the important parts? First, I've created a class, bottom sheet scene, that is of type any, and the class is deriving from overlay scene. So if you take a look in this interface, it's an interface that derives from a scene, which is also something that comes from Navigation 3. So you have a scene, and then because my bottom sheet is an overlay, I'm deriving from an overlay scene. What this overlay scene does is it is allowing me to have overlaid entries. So what are the entries that are going to be overlaid when my destination is going to be rendered? Then I had to overwrite a bunch of properties. The first one is key, which is a key for the scene itself, previous entries or the backstack of the entries that were opened before, overlaid entries, what are the entries that this particular scene is going to draw over. Keep in mind here that we may have a large display that has a list and details panes at the same time so that we can also draw over both of them, a bottom sheet. Then I added one more property for the entry itself, in this case the bottom sheet. Inside the body I have one more override for the entries, which is list of nav entries, and in this case I just said, okay, my only item inside the list is gonna be the entry that I'm passing in. Ultimately I had to override the content property, which is a composable. So basically inside this lambda we can write any composable that we want. Now for my bottom sheet I had a component that was integrating model bottom sheet inside, so I don't have to do anything here other than calling entry.content. But it's important to keep in mind that if we want to here, we can have a model bottom sheet and then add here inside as a content, the entry content. So that's also possible. I can wrap it into a column, into a box, into whatever I really want. In this case, I'm just calling entry content, but keep in mind that here we are having a composable lambda, so we can write any kind of composed code inside that we want. Now that's all about my bottom sheet scene. As we can see, it is very, very simple. And then I have one more class, which is a bottom sheet scene strategy, which derives this time from the scene strategy. And when we derive from the scene strategy, we have to override a single function, which is calculate scene. And the calculate scene function, as we can see, returns a scene. So what I do inside is I'm taking the last entry from my entries that are being passed here, and then I'm going to read the metadata of that particular entry. And if the metadata is empty, then I'm going to say null. Otherwise, I'm going to return the bottom sheet scene, which is the scene that we have created here, this class. Now, the metadata is part of the entries API, and it is basically a map of string and any, and we did take a look into the metadata in the previous video. So we can utilize the metadata to pass things around. So we can say for particular key, it's going to be a particular value. You can imagine, for example, in the case of a model bottom sheet or a dialog, you can pass some form of properties around. In this case, I have also created here a convenience companion object. I could pass here additional properties, and then I can take those properties and pass them inside the map for a given key to have a particular value. In this case, I'm hard coding UUID. It doesn't really matter, but I could have taken something inside this function and pass it in my map. Then inside this override, I can read that from the metadata, because this map that we are passing here is actually the same metadata that we are getting here. And then from that metadata, I can read the properties that were passed. So I can pretty much say here, last entry, metadata, bottom sheet key. And that's gonna be the UUID that I'm passing. So if I had to, from my nav display, when I'm creating my entry, I can pass a metadata, and here I'm saying bottom sheet. And inside this bottom sheet, I can pass UUID if I had to, or something else. And then inside here, as I mentioned, I could have read that, pass it in the metadata map, and then read it here inside the calculate scene function and pass it all the way to the bottom sheet scene. And then inside the bottom sheet scene, I could have done something with it when rendering that content. So that's something to keep in mind when you're creating your own scenes. As of the arguments that I'm passing inside the bottom sheet scene, I'm passing key, which comes from the last entry content key. As of previous entries, I'm taking in the entries and I'm dropping last one. The last one is the bottom sheet itself. So then as a previous entry, we are gonna have the screen that we are laying over. And therefore also for the overlaid entries, I'm dropping last one. So I'm basically dropping the bottom sheet that we are opening, that entry. And lastly, as an entry, I'm passing the last entry, which is the last or null, or basically the bottom sheet itself. So the one that we are dropping in these two. And basically that's all about this custom scene strategy. Fairly simple and easy to work with, so that we can create our custom scene strategies on demand when we need them. Now, one more very important thing to be aware of, if I go back to my nav display, it may happen that my nav display need to have more scene strategies. As I mentioned before, imagine that we are having a multi-pane, like list details pane, and then we need to show bottom sheets there. Or maybe we want to show an alert dialog. How do we do that? Well, probably it will be possible inside our custom scene strategy to do some crazy casting to determine which entry is what, and then do some crazy stuff inside there, but that's less than ideal. What we can do instead is we can define all the scene strategies that we want to use here. In this case, I'm gonna define one more, and again, I'm going to call remember, and inside I'm gonna say single pane scene strategy. So I'm choosing that one for the sake of simplicity. I'm also going to pass as a generic my nav key. And now that I have this additional scene strategy, what I can do is I can chain them. So here for the scene strategy property, I can say bottom sheet scene strategy, then one more scene strategy. And this is the way I can chain them. So the API is providing us with this infix function then that we can also call by saying then and then passing the additional strategy like that. Then we can call then again, and so on and so forth. And this is the way we can chain multiple scene strategies for a single nav display. Now that's it. Thanks for watching, and let me know if it was useful in the comments below. Cheers.